is ATN International News. First, the headlines. King Charles to acknowledge painful aspects of UK's past.
Group says 31 journalists killed in Israel-Hamas war.
US military starts to buy seafood from Fukushima.
Ukrainian family of 9 killed in Volnovaka.
White House assures of increase in aid going into Gaza.
Company found guilty for 2 deaths in volcano disaster.
Now the rest of our stories. King Charles to acknowledge painful aspects of UK's past. King Charles and his wife Camilla are on a 4-day state visit to Kenya, where he will acknowledge painful aspects of the UK's colonial past. More than 10,000 people were killed and others tortured during the brutal suppression of the Mau Mau uprising in the 1950s, one of the British Empire's bloodiest insurgencies. In 2013, Britain expressed regret and paid out £20 million to more than 5,000 people, but some feel that that didn't go far enough. Historian Caroline Elkins says the anticipated announcement by the monarch will be an extraordinary moment, but adds that the right thing would be to insist upon proper investigations done by the government to change history books, to change museums in Britain, and to provide funding in Kenya to establish its own museums and cultural artifacts. She says that the atrocities committed during the state of emergency declared by the colonial government in October 1952 in response to the Mau Mau revolt were done in the monarch's name. Queen Elizabeth II acceded to the throne just 8 months earlier while on a visit to central Kenya, where the rebellion had been brewing. It was Her Majesty the Queen whose pictures hung in detention camps, and as they were being tortured and forced to labor, they had to sing "God Save the Queen." The Mau Mau attacks could be brutal and would often occur at night. Images of 6-year-old Michael Rock hacked to death along with his parents and a farmhand and his bloody teddy bears were published in newspapers abroad and drew no sympathy for the fighters. The colonial government used its air power and ground forces that included many Kenyans, known as the Home Guards, to mount a brutal crackdown on the Mau Mau. Ms. Elkins estimates that as many as 320,000 people were interned in detention or concentration camps. Prisoners were reportedly castrated, flogged to death, and even set on fire. More than 1,000 were executed by hanging during the emergency period. The total death toll is estimated to be in the thousands. Historians have described the operations to crush the revolt as the bloodiest post-war conflict the UK was involved in last century.
Rugby World Cup win. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has declared a public holiday after the country won the 2023 Rugby World Cup in Paris on Saturday. The Springboks claimed the 4th Rugby World Cup win in the weekend, defeating New Zealand by 1 point, 12-11. The president said he had made the decision in celebration of the Springboks' momentous achievement in nationwide address Monday. It would take place on 15th December. Mr. Ramaphosa said the government wanted the day off to be a day of hope, a day of celebration and unity. Our sportsmen and women have shown us what is possible. The win has been hailed by the president as a sign of hope as the country struggles with the world's highest unemployment rate at 42%, and as well as other economic problems, including high poverty rates and frequent blackouts. Following the team's World Cup win in Stade de France, Mr. Ramaphosa said he wanted the team's unity to become a greater future of society. We need more of this, and not just in the domain of sporting achievement, he said, pointing out that the number of black players in the squad has gone up from 1 in 1995 to almost half of South Africa's players in the 2023 finals. At the weekend, Mr. Ramaphosa said also the team showed many of the qualities he felt would be necessary to tackle South Africa's status as the most unequal country in the world. The patriotism we display in sports stadiums should be reflected in our approach to overcoming our challenges, he said. South Africa's Saturday win means the team has now won half of the 8 tournaments they have participated in.
IDF says it struck Hezbollah infrastructure in Lebanon. The Israel Defense Forces has released footage showing what it says is an airstrike targeting Hezbollah's infrastructure in Lebanon. IAF fighter jets struck Hezbollah terrorist infrastructure, including the Israel Defense Forces has released footage showing what it says is an airstrike targeting Hezbollah's infrastructure in Lebanon. IAF fighter jet struck Hezbollah terrorists infrastructure, including weapons, posts, and sites in Lebanon. The IDF said on Tuesday in a post on X, Hezbollah, a powerful Lebanese militia backed by Iran and Hamas ally, has exchanged cross-border fire with the IDF since 7th October.
Lisa Durton from the UN's humanitarian agency OCHA said people are becoming increasingly desperate in Gaza as they search for food, water, and shelter amid a relentless bombing campaign that is wiping out whole families and entire neighborhoods. Director Durton wants another entry point into Gaza opened at Kerem Shalom between Israel and Gaza, the only crossing apparently equipped to process a large number of trucks. Director Durton also detailed how the healthcare system is in tatters, with patients on the floor and surgeons operating without anesthesia. There are 1,000 patients dependent on dialysis and 130 premature babies in incubators whose lives hang by a thread at a hospital backup generators run on fumes. She said OCHA was deeply concerned by allegations of military installations in the close vicinity of hospitals and the request by Israeli authorities for hospitals to be evacuated. She said there is nowhere safe for patients to go, and moving those on life support and babies in incubators would almost certainly be a death sentence.
Red Crescent says situation in hospital out of control. Tomoso Delta Longa, spokesperson for the International Federation of the Red Crescent told press earlier that the situation there is out of control. The hospital is crowded with patients, injured people, and more than 10,000 people who sought refuge in the hospital because they thought that it was the safest place. People are living in the corridors, on stairs, outside and inside, plus 500 patients and are receiving life-saving care. I'm talking about intensive care units, babies in incubators who need oxygen. Delia Longa added. He said the Red Cross was deeply concerned about the evacuation order the Palestinian Red Crescent says was given to doctors by Israel. In this situation, there is no possible way to evacuate the patients. And he added resources are absolutely limited and running out minute by minute at the facility, with its warning fuel supply, meaning power will run out soon.
Marwan Jalani, Director General of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, just spoke to press from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, around 51 miles from northern Gaza. He says the Al-Quds hospital in Gaza City was under heavy bombardment overnight, with his colleagues at the facility saying the strikes were so close the whole building was shaking. They didn't know whether they were going to hit the hospital. 2 Al-Quds outbuilding, an emergency medical center, and main warehouse were severely damaged and are now out of service, Jalani adds. He says the hospital has not received any aid and staff members are collapsing due to the physical and psychological stress.
Israeli military says 300 targets hit in air. Ground attacks. The Israel Defense Forces have issued an update on the offensive in Gaza, saying around 300 targets were hit over the last day in both air strikes and ground attacks. The IDF also says numerous Hamas terrorists have been killed by troops who battled terrorist cells that fired both anti-tank missiles and machine gun fire toward them. Among the targets successfully hit, the update says, are anti-tank missile and rocket launch posts below a tunnel shaft shafts, as well as military compounds inside underground tunnels. At least 31 journalists have been killed covering the conflict between Israel and Hamas, according to the latest count from the Committee to Protect Journalists. Of the casualties, 26 were Palestinian, 4 Israeli, and 1 Lebanese. A further 8 journalists have been reportedly injured, while 9 are considered missing or detained, the CPJ says. Journalists in Gaza face Journalists in Gaza face particularly high risk as they try to cover the conflict in the face of an Israeli ground assault, devastating Israeli airstrikes, disrupted communications, and extensive power outages, the organization said in a statement on Monday. Among the dead are Rushdie Sarraj, a well-known Palestinian filmmaker, and Issam Abdullah, a Beirut-based videographer for Reuters, who was killed near the Lebanon border by shelling coming from the direction of Israel, according to the CPJ. The IDF said it was investigating the claim. The IDF also the press news agencies that it could not guarantee the safety of the journalists operating in the Gaza Strip after they had sought assurances that their employees would not be harmed by Israeli strikes.
2 Tanzanian students taken hostage by Hamas in Gaza have been named by the Israeli government. Joshua Loito Molel and Clemens Felix Matenga were in Israel as part of an agricultural internship program, Israel's foreign ministry said on X. They were kidnapped by Hamas terrorists and are being held hostage in Gaza, the statement read. Mr. Molel's father told the press he has hope that his eldest son will return safely. Tanzania's ambassador to Israel has assured both families the 2 governments were working together to secure their release. However, the Tanzanian authorities have not commented publicly on the seizure of their citizens. Before it was confirmed that his son, 21, had been taken hostage, Mr. Molel told the press he couldn't eat or sleep because he was desperate to know what had happened to him. When I go to the market, people ask me why I'm losing so much weight, he said last week. The last time Mr. Molel spoke to his son on Thursday, 5th October, 2 days before the Hamas gunmen attacked Kibbutz Nahal Oz, where he was studying, the last words he said were, "Be on your best behavior because you are somewhere new and make the most of the internship you were there to do." Mr. Mtenga's sister told the press they were worried about him but remained hopeful that they would be rescued. The family says they have been in contact with Mr. Mtenga's roommate, who managed to avoid being captured by Hamas, and keeps them informed about the situation in Israel. They had one message for the 22-year-old. He should be courageous where he is, know that we love him, and we pray for him day and night, hoping that he will be back soon. They were among 260 Tanzanian students in Israel on 7th October. 1,400 people were massacred by Hamas, which the UK, US, and other Western powers class as terrorist organization in Israel. More than 230 hostages were taken over the border to the Gaza Strip, which is under the Hamas control. Israel says they come from 20 countries, including one South African who is yet to be identified. The South African authorities have not commented. Hamas says it has hidden the hostages in safe places and tunnels within Gaza. 4 of the hostages have been released, including Yujved Lishit, an 85-year-old grandmother who was kidnapped alongside her husband, Oded, from a different kibbutz. During the handover, she shook the hand of her Hamas captor. She said she had been bitten with sticks while being taken to Gaza, but had otherwise been well treated. Since the attack, Israel has retaliated with airstrikes that have killed more than 8,000 people, according to Gaza's health ministry, which is run by Hamas.
Israeli forces have pushed deeper into northern Gaza Strip with tanks briefly cutting an evacuation route to the south, Palestinian witnesses say. One tank was filmed on Salah al-Din Road, sparking speculation it could be part of an advance on Gaza City. The video showed a car turning around after approaching the tank, which seems to open fire and destroy it. Later, Israel's military said a soldier being held hostage by Hamas was rescued in an overnight ground operation. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hailed the freeing of Private Ori Megiddish, who was said to be doing well, as an exciting achievement that expressed Israel's commitment to release the more than 230 other hostages. He also condemned as cruel psychological propaganda a video released by Hamas that showed another 3 Israeli women in captivity in Gaza demanding he agreed to a prisoner exchange. The hostages, who include dozens of children and elderly people as well as soldiers, were taken by Hamas gunmen during an unprecedented attack on southern Israel on 7th of October, in which 1,400 people were killed. Over the weekend, Israel began what Mr. Netanyahu called the second stage of a war intended to destroy Hamas, with ground forces expanding their operations inside Gaza after 3 weeks of intense bombardment. Gaza Hamas-run health ministry says more than 8,300 people have been killed in the territory since then, while supplies of food, water, fuel, and medicines for its 2.2 million residents are dangerously low. Mr. Netanyahu has also rejected calls for a ceasefire in Gaza, saying that to pause military operations would be to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. Today, we draw a line between the forces of civilization and the forces of barbarism. He told a news conference on Monday. Israel will stand against the forces of barbarism until victory. I hope and pray that civilized nations everywhere will back this fight. Aid agencies have constantly called for a pause in the fighting in order to send aid to the besieged territory. The video showing the tank on Salah al-Din Road was posted by photojournalist Yosef Bassam, who drove northward in a car on Monday morning. Bassam's car is seen coming to a stop just after an intersection known as Netzrim Junction, which is 2.8 kilometers from the perimeter. Fence with Israel and about 3 kilometers south of Gaza City. He then zooms in on a second vehicle that is slowing down in front of what looks like piles of earth in the middle of the road and a stationary tank. The tank starts to move while the second vehicle carries out a 3-point turn. A flash is then seen coming from the direction of the tank just before the car is hit by an explosion. He is gone. The whole family is gone, shouts one of the men inside Bassam's car as it speeds away and returns southward. A photographer who was in the area following on air strike told the press, "Suddenly I looked back and I saw Israeli tank. He took a couple of pictures and then fled." The Israeli military's chief spokesperson was asked specifically about the tanks at a briefing and declined to give more information. "We have expanded our operations involving armor, infantry, and offensive actions within the Gaza Strip. This is done to achieve the 2 primary objectives of the war, which are countering Hamas and securing the return of the kidnapped individuals." Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari said, "While I cannot provide specific details here, I can assure you that the security of our forces remains our top priority." Earlier, the Israeli military said tanks and troops had continued to expand the ground operations inside Gaza overnight, killing dozens of Hamas fighters barricaded in buildings and tunnels. Air and artillery strikes had hit another 600 terror targets over the previous 24 hours, including weapons depots, anti-tank missile launching positions, and hideouts, it added.
Israeli ambassador to the UN, Gilad Erdan, has vowed to wear a yellow star until the UN Security Council condemns the atrocities of Hamas and demands the immediate release of hostages. The UN Security Council has failed to pass a series of resolutions addressing the situation in Israel and Gaza due to a lack of consensus. The Yellow Star of David was forced upon Jews by the Nazis to single them out in public. Today, pinning the star is seen as a way of evoking the Holocaust.
Netanyahu asked whether ground operation will help secure release of hostages. Netanyahu is asked by a member of the media gathered in Tel Aviv about Israel's position that its ground operation in Gaza will secure the release of hostages taken by Hamas. He replies, our common assessment of not only the cabinet members but all the security forces and the military is that the ground action actually creates the possibility, not the certainty of getting our hostages out, because Hamas will not do it unless they're under pressure. We're committed to getting all the hostages back home, Netanyahu adds.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has released a video message in the last few minutes following the rescue of an Israeli soldier taken hostage by Hamas. In a message posted on X, formerly Twitter, Netanyahu says, "Welcome home to Private Ori Megiddish, who the IDF said was freed during Israel's ground operation in Gaza overnight." Netanyahu says the rescue reflects his country's commitment to rescuing abductees and praises the Israeli military and intelligence service for their efforts. He says to Hamas that Israel will continue to target its members.
The families of the hostages who appeared in the video released earlier by Hamas have just given a press conference. Remus Aloni, father of Daniel Aloni, seen in the video, said, "When he saw her picture on the television, my heart nearly stopped beating." He said he and his wife felt a sigh of relief that she was alive. We really want her to come back to us so we can hug her, he said. Daniela's sister Sharon Aloni Corneo and three of Remus Aloni's grandchildren were also taken hostage. He goes on to say the Red Cross must not remain on the sidelines. They must demand to see all hostages, he says, adding two of his daughters need regular medication and without it their health could deteriorate. He also goes on to urge the Emir of Qatar to make every possible effort to bring them home.
Gershon Baskin, who helped secure the release of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit from Hamas in 2011, says the hostage video that emerged on Monday presents an extraordinary dilemma for Israeli decision makers. Speaking to press, he says Hamas wants an all-for-all deal, meaning a trade of the hostages it holds for some 6,000 to 7,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. Baskin says doing an agreement for part of the group of hostages, the civilians, the women, the children, the elderly, would still leave tens of hostages in Hamas' hands, probably 50, 60, or 70. He adds, "We don't know the exact number of hostages that Hamas consider to be soldiers, whether they are or not, and that is an impossible reality for Israel to deal with as well." He says most of the Palestinian prisoners in Israel jail are from the West Bank and most are not members of Hamas. You are watching the international news on Atlantic Television Network. We return after this break.
Welcome back. This is International News on Atlantic Television Network. Now to the rest of our stories. U.S. military starts to buy seafood from Fukushima. The U.S. military in Japan has started to buy bulk of the seafood in response to a Chinese import ban after the release of treated water from the Fukushima nuclear plant. The U.S. ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, said Washington may also look into other ways to help counter China's ban. He described it as part of Beijing's economic wars. China, which was the biggest buyer of Japanese seafood, said it banned imports due to safety fears. Last year, Japan exported more than 100,000 tons of scallops to China. The first purchase under the U.S. scheme is a fraction of that, just under a metric ton of the shellfish. Mr. Emanuel told the press it is the start of long-term contract that will extend over time to all types of seafood. The purchases will be used to feed military personnel and be sold in shops and restaurants on military bases in Japan. It's going to be a long-term contract between the U.S. Armed Forces and the fisheries and co-ops here, Mr. Emanuel said. The best way we have proven in all the instances to kind of wear out China's economic coercion is come to the aid and assistance of the targeted country or industry, he added. The U.S. military had not previously bought Japanese seafood in Japan, and Washington may also look at its fish imports from Japan and China, Mr. Emanuel said. In response to Mr. Emanuel's comments, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Weibin told a news conference on Monday the responsibility of diplomats is to promote friendship between countries rather than smearing other countries and stirring up trouble. In recent months, Mr. Emanuel has spoken out about China on various issues, including its economic policies and treatment of foreign businesses. His comments come as several top U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, have visited Beijing in an effort to ease tensions between the world's two biggest economies. More than 1 million tons of treated wastewater accumulated at the Fukushima nuclear plant after it was severely damaged in a 2011 tsunami. The Chinese import ban came despite Japan saying the water was safe and many scientists agreeing. The United Nations nuclear watchdog also approved the plan. Tokyo has also stressed that similar release of wastewater are common from other nuclear power plants in China and France. Japan makes regular reports to show that the seawater near Fukushima is showing no detectable levels of radioactivity. On Sunday, trade ministers from the Group of Seven, an organization of the world's largest so-called advanced economies, called for the immediate repeal of bans on Japanese food.
Police in India have arrested a man in connection with a series of explosions at Jehovah's Witnesses meeting in the southern state of Kerala. 3 people were killed and more than 50 injured in the blast at a program held by the Christian-based religious movement on Sunday. Police said the man, Dominic Martin, was arrested under anti-terror law. He had earlier posted a video claiming responsibility for the attacks and surrendered to police. The blast took place during the last day of a prayer session organized by Jehovah's Witnesses in the town of Kalamesari, about 10 kilometers northeast of the port city of Kochi. More than 2,000 people were attending the 3-day event. T.A. Sirikumar, a regional spokesperson for the Jehovah's Witnesses, told local media that the first blast took place in the middle of a hall, and 2 more explosions took place seconds later on either sides of the hall. 2 women who attended the meeting died on Sunday, while a 12-year-old girl with 95% burns succumbed to her injuries on Monday. Hours after the explosion, Mr. Martin posted a video on Facebook claiming to be a former member of the Jehovah's Witnesses who planned the blast because he was angry with the group's teachings. But Mr. Srikumar told press that Mr. Martin was not a registered member. Police said Mr. Martin was from Kerala State and had worked in Dubai earlier. We are convinced that he committed the crime based on his confession and corroborating pieces of evidence we collected, Kochi City Police Commissioner A. Akbar said on Monday. Mr. Akbar said Mr. Martin was cooperating with the police. The blast sent shockwaves across the country, and security was stepped up in Delhi, Mumbai, and other cities. The Jehovah's Witnesses in a religious movement which believes that traditional Christian churches have deviated from the actual teachings of the Bible and Armageddon is imminent. The group, which claims to have about 8.7 million followers worldwide and some 60,000 in India, has a strong presence in Kerala and is known for door-to-door evangelism in the state. Queen Richard, a member of Jehovah's Witness who was in the hall when the bomb exploded, said she initially thought a short circuit had caused the explosion. As we closed our eyes and prayed, we heard that explosion in the center of the hall. There was a huge flame, she said, adding that she and her husband, who has a disability, found it difficult to leave the hall. As soon as I got outside, I fainted and fell down, she said.
Nine people, including 2 young children, have been found shot dead in their house in the Russian-occupied eastern Ukrainian town of Volnovka. Ukrainian officials say they believe Russian soldiers killed the whole of the Kapkanet family on 27th October for refusing to give them their house. Russian investigators say 2 male suspects have been held, saying they are Russian soldiers from the Far East. Ukraine and Russia have begun separate investigations into the attack. Photographs have emerged on social media showing blood-splattered and bullet-riddled bodies lying in bed. Some of them still looked in an embrace. Ukrainian Ombudsman Dmytro Lubinets said on Monday the Russians' bloodied hands were involved in the Volodka's killings. According to preliminary information, the occupiers have killed the whole of the Kapkanet family, who were celebrating a birthday and who had refused to hand their own house over to occupiers from Chechnya, he said on Telegram. The Ukrainian-controlled Donetsk prosecutor's office, citing preliminary information, said the attackers in army uniforms shot the family dead after their demand to vacate the house had been rejected. 2 children born in 2014 and 2018 were among the victims, the office added. Russia's official investigations committee described those arrested as Russian soldiers from the country's Far East who had signed contracts with the Russian military. According to preliminary information, the motive for the crime was a domestic conflict, the committee said in a statement. Astra, a Russian news channel on Telegram earlier, quoted the victim's neighbors as blaming the Russian military for the killings. All of the neighbors are saying that the killers were in the military. We're all scared, one neighbor told Astra. Baza, another Russian Telegram channel, said members of the household had a conflict with unidentified men wearing military fatigues with no insignia. Volodka's was captured by Russian forces just weeks after the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Most of the town has been destroyed. The killings in Volodka come as fierce fighting continues on the vast battle front of Ukraine's eastern and southern regions. Kyiv launched its counter-offensive in June, trying to split the occupying Russian troops in the southern Kherson and Zaporizhzhia region in two and make the resupply more difficult. So far, the Ukrainian advance has been slow and costly, as the Russians have had time to prepare their defensive lines. In recent weeks, Moscow has also been on attack near the key city of Avdiivka in the Donetsk region, as well as Kupiansk in the northeastern Kharkiv region. Ukraine's military says all Moscow's attacks have been unsuccessful, reporting heavy Russian casualties around Avdiivka, a gateway to the Russian-held regional capital of Donetsk. The claims by the warring sides have not been independently verified.
Argentina and her Inter Miami forward Lionel Messi has won the men's Ballon d'Or for an 8th time. The 36-year-old was recognized at the ceremony in Paris after helping his country win the World Cup in Qatar last year. England and Real Madrid midfielder Jude Bellingham won the Copa Trophy for the world best player aged under 21. Messi won his record-extending Ballon d'Or award ahead of Manchester City forwarding Erling Haaland. France forward Kylian Mbappe, who became just the second man to score a World Cup final hat-trick in the 4-2 penalty shootout loss to Argentina, finished third. "It is nice to be here once more to enjoy this moment," Messi said, "to be able to win the World Cup and achieve my dream." The former Barcelona and Paris Saint-Germain star added, "I couldn't imagine having the career I've had and everything I've achieved, the fortune I've had to be a part of the best team in history. All of them are special for different reasons."
Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer is to set out his position on the Israel-Gaza war amid growing tensions within the party over the conflict. In a speech on Tuesday, Sir Keir is expected to restate his support for a humanitarian pause to allow aid into Gaza, but he will argue a permanent ceasefire would leave Hamas with the capability to carry out more attacks. A number of senior Labour figures have backed calls for a full ceasefire. Mayors Sadiq Khan and Andy Bonham, Scottish Labour leaders Anna's Sauer, and a number of front benches among those who have diverged from the official party line on the issue. More than 35 Labour MPs and 250 councillors have also called for a ceasefire, with around 30 councillors resigning from the party over the leadership's position on the war. Meanwhile, Andy MacDonald has been suspended as a Labour MP over what the party described as deeply offensive comments at a pro-Palestinian rally. Sir Keir is expected to use his speech to say he understands the desire for a ceasefire, but to argue that a permanent ceasefire at this stage would leave Hamas with the infrastructure and capability to carry out more attacks similar to those of October 7th, when gunmen from the organization entered Israel and killed 1,400 people. Instead, he will repeat calls for a humanitarian pause by not backing a full ceasefire. The Labour leader is aligned with the UK government as well as the US and EU. Compared to a formal ceasefire, humanitarian pauses tend to last for short periods of time, sometimes just a few hours. They are typically implemented purely with the aim of providing humanitarian support as opposed to achieving long-term political solutions, according to the United Nations. However, Sir Keir is expected to say a humanitarian pause could also enable diplomatic progress to be made. Reflecting on his work as a human rights lawyer and as a legal advisor to the Northern Ireland Policing Board, he will argue the only way to end the conflict is through a political process, and will reiterate Labour's support for a two-state solution. The Labour leader is also expected to say that Israel has a right to keep its people safe within the guidelines of international law, as well as saying vital services in Gaza must be switched on. Aid must be ramped up. Israel's military operation must be measured and civilians not permanently displaced. Sir Keir had previously provoked anger from some within the Labour Party, after appearing to suggest Israel had the right to cut off the supply of power and water to Gaza. In an interview with LBC on 11th October, Sir Keir was asked whether this was an appropriate response by Israel to the Hamas attacks. "I think that Israel does have the right," he said. "Obviously, everything should be done within international law, but I don't want to step away from the core principles that Israel has a right to defend herself." A spokesman for the Labour Party, for the Labour leader, later said he had only meant to say Israel had a general right to self-defense. Israel began its bombing campaign in Gaza in retaliation for the cross-border attack by Hamas on 7th October. Gaza's Hamas-run health ministry says 8,000 people have been killed in the territory since then. Israel has also cut off electricity and most water and stopped imports of food, fuel, and other goods.
and singled out of the channel from the river to the sea, used by some pro-Palestinian protesters as deeply offensive to many. Critics of the chant, which refers to the River Jordan and Mediterranean Sea, argue to implicitly call for the destruction of Israel. But some pro-Palestinian activists say most people chanting it are calling for an end to Israel's occupation of the West Bank and blockade in Gaza. Sunak spokesman urged people to be careful with their use of language. After the Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley called for clarity on the definition of extremism, John Downing Street said the government would look at any gaps in the law that might exist. It is important that the frontline officers feel they have certainty and clarity, the spokesman added, but he also insisted that the police did not have power to act.
Ministerial aide has been sacked from his government role after calling for a ceasefire in Gaza. Downing Street said Paul Bristow had made comments which were not consistent with the principles of collective responsibility. In a letter to the Prime Minister last week, Mr. Bristow said a permanent ceasefire would save lives and allow aid to reach those who needed it most. The government supports humanitarian pauses, but not a full ceasefire. During Prime Minister's questions last week, Rishi Sunak said specific pauses would allow more aid into Gaza, but he rejected calls to back a ceasefire, stressing that Israel had a right to defend itself. Mr. Bristow, who is a Conservative MP for Peterborough, was a parliamentary private secretary, the lowest rung of the ministerial ladder, to Michel Donlan, the Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology. After being sacked by Mr. Sunak, he told the press, "I completely understand the PM's decision, and it is with regrets I leave a job I enjoyed, but I can now talk openly about an issue so many of my constituents care deeply about. I believe I can do this better from the back benches rather than as part of the government payroll." A Downing Street spokesman said Paul Bristow has been asked to leave his post in government following comments that were not consistent with the principles of collective responsibility. Collective responsibility is a convention that all members of the government must publicly support government policy, even if they personally disagree with it. A large number of opposition MPs have backed calls for a ceasefire, but very few Conservative MPs have. Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer is under increasing pressure to support a full ceasefire, with senior figures including London Mayor Sadiq Khan, Scottish Labour leader Anna Sauer, and a number of front benches supporting one. So far, Sir Keir has only backed humanitarian pauses, aligning him with the position of the UK government as well as the US and EU. Compared to a formal ceasefire, humanitarian pauses tend to last for a short period of time, sometimes just a few hours. They are implemented purely with the aim of providing humanitarian support as opposed to achieving long-term political solutions. Earlier, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu told a press conference his country will not agree to a cessation of hostilities with Hamas. Calls for a ceasefire are a call for Israel to surrender to Hamas, Mr. Netanyahu said. In his letter to the Prime Minister on Thursday, Mr. Bristow wrote, "My constituents and I are deeply grieved by the heartbreaking and devastating humanitarian crisis now unfolding in Gaza. Thousands have been killed and more than 1 million now displaced. It is difficult to understand how this makes Israel more secure or indeed makes anything better." He added that some of his constituents had been directly affected by the conflict. Posting the letter on Facebook, he wrote that ordinary Palestinians should not suffer collective punishment for the crimes of Hamas. Collective punishment is prohibited under international law. Around 18% of people in Mr. Bristow's Peterborough constituency are Muslims, according to the latest census. It is a marginal seat which he won from Labour with a majority of 2,580 at the least general election. Meanwhile, Andy MacDonald has been suspended as a Labour MP after the party said he had made deeply offensive comments in a speech at a pro-Palestinian rally. Israel has been bombing Gaza since the 7th October attacks by Hamas that killed 1,400 people and saw at least 239 people kidnapped as hostages. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says more than 8,000 people have been killed since Israel's retaliatory bombing began.
Andy McDonald has been suspended as a Labour MP after the party said he made a deeply offensive comment relating to the Israel-Gaza war. The MP for Middlesbrough used the phrase "between the river and the sea" in a speech at a pro-Palestinian rally. Critics of a chant which contains the phrase argue it implicitly calls for the destruction of Israel. But Mr. McDonald said his words were intended as a heartfelt plea for an end to the killings in the region. He will now sit as an independent MP pending an investigation. In a speech at a demonstration on Saturday, Mr. MacDonald, a former shadow minister under Jeremy Corbyn, said, "We will not rest until we have justice, until all people, Israelis and Palestinians between the river and the sea, can live in peaceful liberty." The phrase "from the river to the sea" refers to the land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea, and features in a chant which has been heard at the pro-Palestinian demonstrations. Earlier this month, Home Secretary Suella Braverman urged police chiefs to consider interpreting the chant as an expression of a violent desire to see Israel erased from the world. Israel and most Jewish groups agree. This interpretation is disputed by some pro-Palestinian activists who say that most people chanting it are calling for an end to Israel's occupation of the West Bank and blockade of Gaza, not the destruction of Israel itself. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's spokesman, he said, "The phrase is a deeply offensive chant to many." Mr. McDonald said he was saddened by his suspension and believed it would be overturned after he explained his views to the party's investigation. In a statement, he said there had been a number of misrepresentations of my words in the media, which had further baseless and extremely harmful accusations against me. He added that his words should not be constructed in any other way than they are intended, namely as a heartfelt plea for an end to the killings in Israel, Gaza and the occupied West Bank, and for all peoples in a region to live in freedom without the threat of violence. A Labour spokesperson said Mr. McDonald's comments at the weekend were deeply offensive, particularly at a time of rising anti-Semitism, which has left Jewish people fearful for their safety. And that's the international news for today. Thank you for joining us. Before we go, another major look at the stories.